Welcome to Living Meditations, a channel dedicated to help you enrich your life in every way possible through meditations and related videos. This video is called Understanding Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder in Grief. My name is Vonne Solis. In 2005, my 22-year-old daughter died by suicide. Being a practitioner of metaphysics and spirituality for 2.5 decades prior to her death, after she transitioned, I quickly found my way into the world of angels to gain as deep an understanding of the grief process as possible. In 2006, I certified as an angel therapy practitioner under Doreen Virtue and have remained committed since then to share whatever knowledge I have gained with other grievers. Besides the many spiritual lessons and angel healings I have received, I have also delved into exploring and sharing knowledge on the messier parts of grief that are still largely overlooked in our culture. This includes the many problems grievers face physically, mentally, and emotionally due to the absence of information and adequate support systems to help them cope. While a spiritual and metaphysical understanding of grief is incredibly self-empowering and the best form of holistic healing I have found, it is equally important to understand what's happening to your body and mind in grief too. As they say, knowledge is half the battle. Understanding what you are going through at any given time in grief gives you a way through the pain. In this video, I'll be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder as a valid medical condition that is a very real part of the grief experience, yet very little information is available about PTSD and grief. If you have experienced a recent or previous sudden and unexpected death of a loved one, and especially if you have lost your child, you may be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or in its shortened form, PTSD. Sudden loss produces such extreme shock to our body, it can literally change who we are. It is only natural to expect that grievers coping with traumatic and sudden loss would succumb to PTSD as a result of this shock. Symptoms of PTSD include recurring nightmares, flashbacks, insomnia, the feeling of detachment and isolation from others, avoidance, the inability to focus, remaining in a state of hypervigilance, and experiencing extreme sensitivity to noise and sudden movement. These symptoms can last for months or years without ever being fully understood by the griever, let alone medically diagnosed. If you are experiencing some or all of these symptoms and think you may have PTSD, it is important you see your doctor immediately. I was finally diagnosed with PTSD in 2014 after years of suspecting I had this disorder. As you listen further, learn how this diagnosis was a relief to me, not a threat or embarrassment, and was the catalyst for major positive changes in my life. Early grief, and especially after sudden and traumatic loss, is a time where the mind seems splintered into parts, one that can still make some sense of the minutiae of daily life and routine, and the many other parts that can't make sense of anything at all. It compensates through an overactive and often crazy imagination. In my own grief, besides this, I was experiencing unpredictable and highly volatile mood swings, erratic behavior, and the inability to reason. I had no idea what was wrong with me. I wanted to stay locked inside my house. Yet, 6 months after my daughter died, I had to return to work to help out with the family's finances. I lived in the country and found a job at my local village gas station. While I longed to remain insulated from others, I had to be around co-workers and customers all day or evening long, and I faked being okay just to preserve a basic level of functioning. But I was dying inside. I beat myself up mentally and emotionally on many occasions for not being the person I thought I should be, though I didn't know who this was. I was no longer interested in many of the same things I had been, not even my relationships. Now working and trying to cope with what felt like excessive demands on my already fragile mental and physical state took a further toll on me emotionally, and made me think I really was starting to go crazy. I was certain only that I was doomed to misery and failure for the rest of my life. The symptoms of my PTSD were acute, though I didn't know then I was suffering from this disorder. If I had known early on about PTSD, I am certain I would have been better able to prepare myself, at least intellectually, to deal with the craziness as it surfaced. Instead, I continued to struggle to make sense of and rationalize the choices I was making that seemed highly irrational to not only me, but to those who knew me. When grievers understand PTSD as a very real and valid part of their grief, the craziness they feel trying to rationalize their experience will stop. By understanding PTSD as a natural part of grief after certain types of loss and trauma, grievers can stop making themselves feel bad or wrong for feeling what they are feeling or doing what they are doing. It is important to understand that when we experience shock and trauma, the emotions we express at the time of the event, such as the sudden death of a loved one, are stored as powerfully painful memories within the cells of the body. These emotions surface with nearly the same intensity felt at the time of the actual event whenever certain triggers activate our memories through trauma-associative stimuli. This causes us to experience the event over and over again. Most common in grief are flashbacks of the death and many, if not all, of the related experiences of the moments and hours of that day and the days that followed. Insomnia, mood swings, hypervigilance, extreme sensitivity, avoidance of people, places, and things that remind one of their loved one, and irrational thoughts. Because of the unpredictability of many of these triggers, grievers suffering PTSD live in a heightened state of anxiety, remaining alert to any potential situation that could set them off. In the struggle to stay alert to these triggers, additional stress is placed on the body, often unbeknownst to the griever, who may finally collapse from the building pressure. Living with PTSD can significantly alter your life. The symptoms can last for years, dependent on the type and degree of trauma suffered. The difficulties affect not only the griever, but family members and friends as well, which explains in part the all too frequent breakup of relationships, splintered families, loss of friends and work, and the emotional and sometimes physical isolation grievers feel or physically experience. Grievers need to be made aware early on after traumatic loss about the existence of PTSD in grief and know whether they have this disorder, which is nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, discovering you have PTSD could save your life and, at minimum, bring you the support you desperately need. When I was finally diagnosed with PTSD in 2014, it freed me from merely surviving to reclaiming the balanced life I desperately needed and wanted. Though it took tremendous courage for me to put an end to the life I was living, which included leaving a job I had relentlessly worked at but was not my real passion, and moving across the country. The biggest impact I felt was relief in knowing I wasn't crazy at all, and never had been. I was finally free to be me. While it was impossible for me to start treating my PTSD until 1, I was ready to face my trauma, and 2, found a therapist trained in treating trauma, it was possible for me to start to make sense of my life as it had been in grief to that point. All of my decisions at every critical juncture in my healing process finally made sense. Because in my early grief and trauma, I thought that most traditional therapists could not identify with my loss and therefore would not be able to reach the core root of my pain, which is absolutely necessary for treatment to be effective, I opted not to pursue grief therapy. I didn't even know about, much less think about, pursuing trauma therapy. One of the reasons I am starting to speak publicly about PTSD in grief is because of the apparent failure for medical professionals to diagnose PTSD in grievers. There are many reasons for this, not least a griever's reluctance to seek help and be honest with their doctor about what's really going on with their mental and emotional state. The other is the doctor's ability through their training and experience to diagnose PTSD. They don't necessarily look for it in grief. Another problem is that once PTSD is diagnosed, it falls on the patient to find a psychotherapist or psychologist trained in trauma and grief therapies to take them on as a patient. This can be hit and miss and expensive just doing the initial meet and greet or intake appointments where the patient is assigned to a therapist they have yet to meet. Once a therapist is found who has experience in treating trauma and grief, and they usually indicate this as part of their credentials online, a certain level of trust has to be gained between the patient and therapist for any success in treatment to occur. For the individual, there can be a lot of resistance coming face to face with traumatic issues that need to be healed. A therapist must be sensitive to this resistance and even use different therapy approaches to ensure the patient, who is already feeling vulnerable and exposed, feels safe enough to share their worst fears and darkest thoughts, largely centered on their own guilt and self-blame for whatever trauma has occurred. A patient can quickly feel mistrust of a therapist who they sense cannot help them. If they don't trust their therapist, a griever will not share their deepest pain, and this is true for any patient of a doctor or therapist. As a result, many grievers are left on their own to cope with symptoms they don't understand without adequate treatment or support. If you think you may have PTSD, in order to be sure, there are checklists online that you can download and fill in and take to your doctor if you believe you meet the criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. I have provided a link below this video to get you started. Your doctor should be able to verify your results and recommend appropriate treatment based on their own diagnosis of your health. As you feel brave enough to seek treatment, bear in mind that you should never be made to feel wrong for what you are feeling or thinking in grief by anyone. This includes the expectation you may be putting on yourself to feel or think a certain way. Whatever you feel or think after loss is valid and will change over time, as will the help you need. But during the roughest of times, especially in the early days of grief, and as you do become aware of what's going on inside of you, this support and understanding is critical to your healing. Being aware of everything you are experiencing in early grief will help you regain a sense of balance in your life much earlier than not ever knowing what's going on. Though a subject for another video, in my experience as a bereaved mom, as I continually monitored and assessed my health needs, I often needed to rebalance my life, which for several years included constantly modifying my work schedule while I was still working for a large bureaucracy. The employer didn't know what I needed. I had to tell them, and I always got what I needed, whether it was part-time hours, working at home until my eventual demise led to disability. Done correctly, an employer can always be made aware of an employee's needs, particularly where PTSD is concerned, though the outcomes may differ as to what an employer can offer. As you continue to go through your healing process, and I know that this term is easier to digest the longer you have been bereaved, it is essential to trust your instincts about what you need health-wise and not allow issues to get in the way of your recovery. This means not feeling embarrassed that you may need help, but rather feeling confident and proud of yourself for finding the courage to ask for it. It means not succumbing to the stigma associated with mental health disorders, of which PTSD is one, and instead, remember you have suffered a trauma, and it is completely believable, understandable, and acceptable that you may not be as mentally and emotionally healthy as you think. Whatever you are going through, remember, you are not alone. You don't have to handle everything yourself. There are medical professionals out there who do want to help. You just have to find them. Once you do, let them be part of your support team. An excellent book published in 2015 by a psychiatrist in the United States that can help you understand PTSD and its effects through medical case studies and types of therapies used to treat trauma, though I will say grievers are missing as one of the target groups susceptible to suffering PTSD, is called The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma, written by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. I have also included a link to Dr. van der Kolk's Trauma Center below this video if you are interested in learning more about trauma and other resource materials this center offers. There are a host of other sites online as well that in your search to learn more about trauma and whether or not you may have been affected by post-traumatic stress disorder will likely be another good starting place if you are not yet ready to do a self-checklist and see a doctor. Rest assured, whatever trauma you have experienced, there isn't one other person out there who would want to trade places with you. That should be enough in itself to tell you that what you have survived or are surviving is worthy of your attention. Don't forget to check out other information videos and meditations on the Living Meditations channel related to grief, the soul, healing, and empowerment to help you live as positively and enlightened as you choose.